A returning guest, Jeff Nielson. Jeff is a writer, editor, managing partner of Bullion Bulls Canada. He's published approximately 1,000 commentaries on mainstream news and precious metals websites around the world, and I am very happy to have him back on the X22 Report Spotlight. Jeff, welcome back to the Spotlight.
Hi, Dave. It's great to be back.
Hey, thanks for being here. And let's just start off with the economy. Right now in the U.S., we have the debt ceiling coming up September. We have the budget, which only goes to September 30th. And we've been seeing retail stores close, housing really not doing them well, especially in Canada, where we see a lot of things where they're headed the opposite way now, where the bubbles seem to be deflating a little bit. I wanted to get your take on how you see the economy and where do you think it is headed right now?
Well, I actually wrote a piece just a couple of months back talking about the Great Western Depression, because I think the entire Western world has been in this steady downtrend since the crash of '08. There's never been any economic recovery in any of these nations of any great significance. The only thing that has masked the steady deterioration in our economies are the housing bubbles, because of course when you use these ridiculous, fraudulent, ultra-low interest rates to manufacture housing bubbles, you get some incidental economic activity along with that. You get a lot of construction, for instance. And so, of course, that puts some dollars into the pockets of working people. And, of course, that's what really makes economies healthy. Not the fat getting fatter, but, middle-class people actually having some disposable income. And so these housing bubbles that have been deliberately fabricated across the Western world with these fraudulent interest rates have been masking the level of deterioration across the West. And of course, probably the U.S. is deteriorating faster and more severely than every place else. But it just means that they tell you, that much bigger lies to pretend the opposite.
What's very interesting is there's a lot of things that are starting to remind me of 2008, previous to when the market came down, where we saw like Bear Stearns, they were in trouble. AIG was in trouble. Up in Canada, we see Home Capital Group. They're in trouble. Depositors have been taking their funds out of that financial institution. They're in trouble. We have Banco Popular in Spain, where they just had a bail-in. And I believe this is probably just the first step, because we know there's going to be other banks that are going to fall and they're going to have to use the bail-in documents. When you're looking at this and you see these things happening here, does this remind you of 2008?
I would certainly agree with you that this is another very strong signal that we're at the very end of this bubble and crack cycle. And of course, there's two ways you can look at it. You can pretend that you can assume that all of the mainstream media news on the economy has been accurate, and that we're actually at the top of our economic cycle. And in that case, the question you ask yourself is, how can we be having all of these banks on the verge of failure at the top of the economic cycle? So, of course, that should be a reality check for a lot of people who actually take those statistics seriously. But then the other side of the coin, of course, is if you follow my premise that it's been pure statistical fabrication, there's been no economic growth, and we've been steadily deteriorating, then of course that perfectly explains why we see banks getting into trouble. Because that's when banks get into trouble, is not when things are going up, but when things are going down. And so this is another indication that our economies have been in a steady downtrend and not in a steady uptrend, because we see cumulative banking problems in many Western nations. And of course, one of the only reasons the U.S. banks aren't more obviously in trouble is simply because of how many trillions were stuffed into their vaults following the crash of '08.
That is true. And what worries me is the beginning of this bail-in. I mean, we saw the bail-in in Cyprus. I believe they were going to do a bail-in in Greece, but the people in Greece started removing their funds from the banks. And I think they looked at it and said, okay, we can't really bail in right now. But the bank in Spain, Banco Popular, I think this is like one of the first times where they actually use the EU documents to bail in. And you could see this is paving the way. And the United States has the documents to bail in. And when the banks go down, basically people are going to lose their money inside the banking system.
Well, I was really vocal about this when back in, I think it was 2013, when this whole massive new form of bank fraud became the next wave. And just pointing out that there's this is totally lawless behavior. There is no way in our legal system that you can create any context where what they're doing is legitimate. There is no possible argument in contract law or equity or any other facet of our legal system that could possibly justify this sort of confiscation of wealth. And of course, it's especially true with respect to depositors versus the bank, because the whole premise of conning people into putting their savings into banks is as simple bank accounts is that, oh, it's the safe place to put your money. So the idea that depositors could be engaging in some sort of implicit contract with the bank to make their capital available should the bank get into trouble is absolutely outrageous, because the reality is the exact opposite. Nobody would ever put their money into the bank unless they thought that money was absolutely secure, and of course that would mean it could never be available for a bail-in. So I think that's why we see with this latest Spanish bailout that they didn't touch the depositors. I think that the criminals at the top have understood now that this is the ultimate red flag, and they're only going to get one crack at stealing depositor money. So I think what you're going to see with these bail-in frauds is there's going to be a big bail-in. It's going to be coordinated across the Western world at the very peak of the crisis that is being manufactured for us, and at that point, depositors will not be safe. Because, like I say, the criminals know they're going to get one kick at this cat only, and they're going to grab as much as they can from everybody, as many people as they can.
So you're saying, like, when the system goes down, they're just going to do one bail-in?
Because they will never get it. And for exactly the reason you talked about with Greece, as soon as the people got this sense that this was coming, they started pulling their money out of the system. So, once any bail-in is done where depositors are skinned, that's going to cause people to start pulling money out of the funds of banks in general. And of course, this is the perverse part of this whole bail-in fraud, is the thing that is of the utmost importance to the banking crime syndicate is that we keep the absolute maximum amount of our wealth in their hands. And so, but they got so greedy, and so desperate that they brought in this form of bail-in fraud, and now they're starting to understand that it's like the proverbial weapon that you can never afford to use, because once they use it the first time, the banking system will never ever be trusted again. The people will never ever put this level of their wealth into the hands of the crime syndicate, and so it'll permanently diminish itself. And so, this is the quandary for the crime syndicate. This is why it's going to be a one-shot deal, because, it's going to be, a moment of ultimate greed or ultimate desperation where they simply say, hey, we have the opportunity to do this. We're going to do it because we're psychopaths and we can't resist.
You said something very interesting that, one, this is a one-shot deal, and then the trust factor, because if we go back to the 30s, they had to insure the deposits to make everyone feel comfortable. Yes, bring your deposits back. We'll insure them. The banks are safe. Back in 2008, people were very nervous, and they said, oh no, we're going to do stress tests. This way, we're going to make sure that the banks are okay. And we knew these were completely fake and phony. But now, if they do this bail-in, are the banks finished after that? How are they going to gain the people's trust once again?
There's no way, because they'll have exposed themselves for what they are, institutions of crime, because the problem is because no depositors have been skinned so far in outside of this one event in Cyprus. Basically, everybody went to sleep right after that, in terms of the general masses. But like I say, the moment that the average Joe gets some of his bank account nicked, even if it's only 5%, that's going to focus attention immediately. That's the sort of thing that can still get riots in the streets, because it's the sort of precisely because of the trust factor. It would be like the ultimate betrayal The banks and our governments assuring us that yes, there is no no safer place in the universe for your wealth than inside a bank, and then the bank robs you. So once you're betrayed in that manner, how do the bankers ever recover from that? Well, they can't.
Yeah, you don't have to worry about the people coming in with masks and guns, because the people that are going to rob you are in suits, ties, and they're working behind the desk there.
The quip I made right after bail-ins were brought in was that they gave the phrase bank robbery an entirely new meaning.
Let's move on to precious metals. We see precious metals, they're being suppressed once again. Today, I think there was 30,000 contracts that were thrown at gold. And we're really not seeing precious metals. I mean, they're moving up, but they're continually suppressing them. We know, I think it was one of the banks, I think it was Deutsche Bank or HSBC, where we heard there was a individual that was actually manipulating the precious metals, and he admitted to it. And we can see that precious metals, they're still being manipulated. Do you see anything in the future or anything that you've been looking at where do you think precious metals are going to finally break free?
Well, I've been consistent, all along over the past few years in saying that the only thing that will ever allow the markets to go higher is going lower first. And so in particular, last year I talked about the fake rally and how the markets were being brought up so that they could be taken down hard. And then, we saw kind of a soft takedown, at the end of the year and early into this year, and then it's drifted up a bit again. So it's almost like this eye of the hurricane sort of phenomenon where we're just getting this lateral drifting where there's really no significant movement one way or the other. But I still haven't changed my viewpoint. In order for precious metals to break out of this chokehold that the bankers have had on this sector since 2011, the markets have to go lower first because prices are extremely low already, but when they're crashed lower, along with, of course, the broader markets, because of course that's a necessity. The banks cannot allow precious metals to appear to be a safe haven in a time of panic. So precious metals must be taken down with all of the other markets, and so it will be done. But when that takedown occurs, it'll take prices to such a stupidly low level and cause such an extremely strong demand response that coming out of that, there's simply no way, even with all of the manipulative might that this crime syndicate possesses, that it can prevent a relief rally. And of course, it should be a much more robust rally than what we saw through 2009, 2011, because the sector is now much more suppressed than it was coming out of the crash of '08. But on the other hand, we might see the opposite. We might see a good rally, but not quite as, not quite at the same magnitude, because of the fact that the crime syndicate now wields this extra manipulative might with their trading algorithms. See, this is the difference at this point in time versus, say, 2009, coming out of the last crash, is in 2009, the banking crime syndicate still had not taken complete control of markets with their trading algorithms. And this is one of the reasons we saw such a strong rally in precious metals from 2009 through 2011, because the trading algorithms were not yet omnipotent. But then what we've seen since that time is the algorithms becoming all-powerful in terms of manipulating markets. And we saw that from 2011 through 2016, where the bankers were simply able to force down precious metals any and every time the markets showed signs of breaking out. And, for people that follow technical analysis, you could have seen, a half a dozen occasions over that period of time where the gold market or the silver market or both made very clear technical breakouts that basically were a certain indicator of at least a medium-term rally, and then instead the markets got stuffed back lower immediately. So that capacity to reverse markets against those sorts of technical trends did not exist prior to this latest cycle.
Now, you mentioned that precious metals have to go lower. How low are you talking about?
Well, I always like to look for clues from the crime syndicate themselves. And of course, when you talk about the crime syndicate, that always starts with Goldman Sachs. And what have we been hearing from Goldman Sachs, like a broken record, for about 6 years now? Gold, $1,000. So my personal belief, ever since I conceived that $1,000 was actually possible, was that yes, it would be taken down to $1,000 just so Goldman Sachs could say that Goldman Sachs was right. Because of course this is a very big part of the crime syndicate mystique, is they want to present the illusion that they're actually simply, really good at what they do, rather than they just have a chokehold on governments and a chokehold on markets that allows them to rob everybody blind.
So do you think they're bringing it down to 1,000 so central banks and other individuals can purchase a lot more of it?
No, because I mean, the whole, and of course, again, we can look at history. So what happened in the crash of '08 was the supply of silver dried up completely. And in terms of physical silver, the only physical silver that was available when the market hit the bottom was basically 100-ounce bars and larger. So, the average person was basically shut out of the silver market, because there's very few average people that can, had enough, even at that price of, $9 an ounce or whatever, to, start buying 100-ounce bars. So this is the thing that happened last time, is that the silver supply dried up completely. Now, this time around, I would not be the slightest bit surprised to see the same thing happen with the gold supply. So what will happen when we see these precious metals markets crashed is, yes, the paper prices are going to go down to, say, $1,000 an ounce for gold, and maybe even $10 an ounce for silver. But the problem is there won't be any metal available except very large denominations, and mostly the wealthy people soaking up those.
I wanted to move on to an article that you wrote that had something called One Bank. And I wanted you to explain what the One Bank is.
Well, going back to the early days of my writing, what I observed with, what I now call the banking crime syndicate is exactly that. It was behaving like a syndicate. There was obvious collusion. And so my initial estimation of this was that it was just a basic oligopoly. And for those of your audience that aren't familiar with that term, an oligopoly is a small collection of companies which collude in order to act like a monopoly and exert complete control over their particular market or sector. And so this is what I had assumed was the case originally, is that we had a collusion model between these Western big banks. So that's what that was my operating premise for several years. Then I came across this article, ironically, in Forbes magazine one day. And it was titled, I believe, the 420 companies that run the world. So that naturally got my attention. But I delved into the article, and what I found was it was based on this computer model from this trio of Swiss academics. And what I also found is that Forbes had mischaracterized the research, because the gist of the research was not, talking about these huge 400 companies that were, more or less running the world, but within this collection of gigantic corporations, these Swiss academics had identified what they called a quote-unquote super entity. This super entity was composed of 144 corporate fronts, with 3/4 of these corporate fronts being financial institutions, hence the name the One Bank. So, but that's not even the most significant part, because the research went on to say that this super entity effectively controlled by itself 40% of the global economy.
Wait, this super entity controlled 40%?
Of the global economy. So we're not talking about a 40% piece of all sectors. We're talking about 100% control of all the most important sectors. So, of course, it's the One Bank. So the heart of the beast is the banking crime syndicate. So it controls all of the big banks. It controls big oil. It controls big pharma. It controls big insurance companies. What other evil? It controls big agriculture. I mean, if you can think of a large evil cabal, corporate cabal that exists, that's part of the 40%.
Wow. So how does this relate to governments? Does it have any influence?
The global economy, I believe, is estimated at around 70 trillion. somewhere around there, maybe a bit more right now. If you control 40% of that, that's essentially like a $28 trillion economy. So that's much larger than the United States. So what we're talking about here is an entity, a crime syndicate with much greater economic mass than the entire United States.
Wow.
In terms of what it, but note, we're talking about control. And this was also a key to the research, is it wasn't talking about ownership. It was talking about the one bank controls 40% of the global economy. And this is a sign of the times. Once upon a time, when our societies and our cultures observed the rule of law, this wouldn't have been as significant as it is today, because in societies that observe the rule of law, the dominant legal relationship is the ownership relationship. If you own something in a society that observes the rule of law, that's preeminent. But of course, we no longer live in societies that observe the rule of law, and so the concept of ownership has been watered down to the point where it's almost meaningless. Because the crime syndicate wants to keep the veneer of civilization and the veneer of legality in our societies, we still have lip service to the concept of ownership, and certainly with respect to each other. All the little people are still bound by the rules of ownership. But of course, the oligarchs and the crime syndicate themselves are not at all bound by the rules of ownership, and nowhere is that better reflected than with respect to the bail-in. What is the gist of the bail-in? We have a bank which controls a bunch of assets that other people own. The bank snaps its fingers, and suddenly the bank owns the assets. So what does ownership mean? Ownership means squat. Control means everything. The one bank controls 40% of the global economy. That's just as good as owning 40% of the global economy in our lawless societies.
Do you know who, is there a hierarchical structure of the one bank? Is there someone sitting, is there a main bank sitting on top?
A cabal of oligarchs.
So is this the New World Order?
Of course, you got me, Dave. And of course, that's another one of the great myths that the crime syndicate has created is quote unquote the New World Order. So you have this all-powerful crime syndicate. It's pretty hard to hide when you control 40% of the global economy. So how do you do so? You create a great big myth, the New World Order. And so all of a sudden, when people can sense this huge, near omnipotent force in the shadows, and they can't quite wrap their heads around it, they don't start looking at the banks. They look at this New World Order that the bankers have manufactured with their mythology, this socialist, one world government hierarchy that's supposedly manifesting itself behind the scenes. And this is the most ludicrous part about it. The idea that powerful people would be getting together behind the scenes so they could share the wealth. Give me a break. If the bankers wanted to create this myth for the crime syndicate to hide behind, at least they could have created a plausible myth.
I'm assuming they also have ties into the precious metals market then.
Well, of course, they have ties in the sense that they're able to manipulate these markets because, of course, they've co-opted all markets with their paper markets. But no, and this is a very important point, and this is part of the reason that there's permanent suppression of precious metals. The crime syndicate had a choice to make, and so here we should back up a bit. So the other thing I didn't get into, of course, is the age of this crime syndicate. One of my sort of heroes and mentors is a gentleman named Charles Lindbergh Sr. He's now deceased. In fact, he's been dead for quite a while, almost 100 years. 100 years ago, he wrote about this crime syndicate that already had a chokehold on the U.S. government. So the one bank is not new. The one bank is very old. It goes back at least 100 years in more or less its present form, and there'll be you can certainly find people who will argue it goes back several centuries in some related form. So this is the ultimate old world order. This is old money. These are the old houses of Europe that have migrated to some extent to the New World, but only in terms of their power base. So I mean, everything is still based in Europe. And so, for instance, did you see the documentary, the fantastic documentary by Bill Still, The Money Masters?
Yes.
So if you'll recall, in that documentary, Bill Still pointed out that J.P. Morgan was nothing more than a Rothschild lieutenant. The supposedly all-powerful J.P. Morgan was just a lackey of the old world order. So yeah, so the point is, the crime syndicate had control of, certainly originally, most of the precious metals wealth that was, not, outside of their clutches. But then they had a choice to make. And it was going to be, what kind of empire did they want to base their crime syndicate upon? A hard asset empire or a paper empire? And they chose paper. And they chose paper for one very important reason in their minds, which is that if you construct a paper empire, it is much, much easier to defraud people much faster and to a much greater degree. It's much harder to rip off people with fraud in an honest money economy where people's wealth is sitting in their own pockets in gold and silver. Get those same people to, have their wealth in paper bank accounts and paper currencies, and you can rob them at will. And of course, I'm pretty sure I've passed along the Alan Greenspan's famous quote before he joined the crime syndicate himself. In the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to prevent the confiscation of savings through inflation. And of course, confiscation of savings is a euphemism for theft of wealth, and inflation is a euphemism for theft by money printing. So, this was Greenspan's great warning before he joined the crime syndicate, is if you stray from an honest money economy, you leave yourself open to unlimited fraud. So this was the choice the bankers made, was to be an empire of paper fraud rather than a crime syndicate that had to do their stealing the old-fashioned way, 1 ounce of gold at a time.
So does this one bank, is this related to the central bank? Is that what we're talking about?
The central banks are their principal tools.
So we have the one bank, and they basically use the central banks.
And so here's the point that people have to realize about the central banks. And the bankers have told us this themselves in their own code. If you listen to any central bank in the Western world, they will tell you every day of their life that they are independent, quote unquote. And people have to understand what this means. So we have, in each of our nations, we have a single economic system. And in that economic system, we have the central banks and we have our governments. So in any system, you can only have one independent entity. That's just a matter of it's tautology. By definition, only one entity can be independent. Only one entity can be totally free, exert totally free will, independent of everybody else. By definition, every other entity is dependent. So when the central banks say they are independent, they are saying unequivocally that they are above our governments. And of course, our governments demonstrate this every day of our lives by never attempting to defy the central banks. And of course, in the U.S., we've seen the classic example of this when, occasionally some U.S. politicians will have the temerity to try to seek an audit of the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve just, reacts in utter contempt. It's like, what are you lackeys saying? We're independent. We are above you. You don't tell us what to do. We tell you what to do. There is the governments, there is the central banks, there is the one bank, and the hierarchy could not possibly be any more obvious.
So since the one bank, they own 40% of the global economy, they can bring down the system or bring it up, or they could do whatever they want with it then.
Well, but it goes beyond this because, again, people have to understand the full degree of evil in the monetary system that has been wrought. And it starts, of course, with the ultimate monetary fraud of when the U.S. took its interest rate to 0%, because, of course, there's no such thing as 0% lending. The whole term is a sham. So 0%, a 0% loan is free money. So the U.S. monetary system went from being at least quasi-legitimate to totally illegitimate. It started funneling free money into the hands of the big banks. And see, this is where people have to understand the full evil of our system with fractional reserve banking, with a fractional reserve ratio that's currently about 35 to 1. So, between 2009 and 2013, B.S. Bernanke conjured close to, or well over $3 trillion of this 0% funny money. More than $3 trillion he gave to the big banks for free. Big banks that are able to leverage all of those trillions by a ratio of 35 to 1. Now, the point is, when you have a legitimate monetary system where the banks are actually having to pay interest to borrow their own money, even at this fraud ratio of 35 to 1, there are limits on the amount of this funny money they can conjure into existence. At a 0% rate of interest, there are no limits. So Bank A gets, let's just, for simplicity's sake, let's just say Bank A got the whole $3 trillion from B.S. Bernanke. Bank A lends that $3 trillion to Bank B at 0% interest, and of course it can lend at 35 to 1. So it lends Bank B $105 trillion at 0%. Bank B takes that $105 trillion, lends it to Bank C, except at 35 to 1, and suddenly, with just 3 banks in the crime syndicate, you've already got $4 quadrillion. Now consider that there are dozens of these banks.
Yeah.
And they can do this daisy chain of fraud as long as they want. So the moment B.S. Bernanke launched this ultimate monetary fraud, it became literally ultimate counterfeiting. The one bank was able to counterfeit infinite dollars. Infinite. So the only problem, of course, is they can't deploy infinite dollars because, again, it's just like the bail-in. It's this fraud that's so horrible and evil that once people see it, it'll be taken away from them. So, if this one bank, went out tomorrow and tried to go on a buying spree and to buy every single asset on the planet Earth, and of course it would only require about 1/10 of its money to do. Well, sorry, we're dealing with infinite money, so it would require not even, its pocket change to do that. People would notice. It's like, oh, wait a second, something's going on here. This isn't right, and then of course the whole fraud comes to an end. But until it reveals the extent of this fraud, it's sitting with literally infinite quantities of funny money.
So with the world basically drowning in debt, we're at 0% interest rates. Europe is in negative interest rates. Japan, negative interest rates. Where are they taking the economy right now?
Well, so the part of the big reason, there was 2 main reasons for taking these interest rates to this ultra low level and freezing them there. One was, as I was saying before, because they wanted to manufacture these real estate bubbles, and of course they're going to pop these bubbles, and take the bigger the bubbles, the worse the real estate crash. The worse the real estate crash, the more millions of people's homes they can steal in the wave of foreclosures that follows. So that's one facet of the plan. But equally important reason for taking the interest rates down to this level and freezing them there permanently is because all of these Western governments are bankrupt. Not merely insolvent, they're bankrupt. And we would see that instantly if any of these bankrupt governments was forced to pay a market rate of interest on their debt. I mean, what's a market rate of interest for the U.S. sitting with $20 trillion of debt? Well, probably 10%. So that's $2 trillion per month in interest payments. Or $2 trillion per year in interest payments, and there's only less than $4 trillion in revenues. I mean, how long can the U.S. pretend it's not bankrupt? When it's paying 50% of its revenues just to service the interest. It's currently only paying 10 to 15%. So it'd be suddenly paying nearly 4 times as much to service its debt. So instant bankruptcy, and the same for virtually all the rest of these Western governments. A few of them might be able to limp along for a couple more years before going bankrupt, but it would just be the old saying, if it was a horse, you'd put it out of its misery at that point.
So you're just saying that, the U.S. and Europe and the rest, they're just going to go belly up.
They already have. The point is, living in this totally fraudulent world, I call it the Wonderland Matrix. So we have this totally fraudulent paradigm that's been fabricated that everybody lives in, that doesn't exist. In this mythological paradigm, our governments are solvent, the U.S. economy is strong, the U.S. dollar is the world's best currency, the U.S. treasuries are valuable assets. Well, none of that exists. In the real world, the U.S. dollar has already been debauched to worthlessness. U.S. treasuries are utterly worthless because of the debts of a worthless government. All of these economies have been in a steady depression all these years. So I call it the Wonderland Matrix because in the movie version, the Matrix was actually a rational place. In our Wonderland Matrix, it's totally perverse because everything's the opposite of reality. Nothing makes sense. Nothing makes the slightest bit of sense. We've been talking about some of that. None of this stuff makes sense.
So I'm gonna ask you this question: how much longer can they keep all of this going then?
Well, you might be asking the wrong person because I was convinced they couldn't keep things going past 2010. But so there's a couple of sayings here. One of them for people that are in the markets is, markets can remain irrational longer than you or I can remain solvent. The other sort of general saying is that in any sort of, period of irrational mania, that irrationality is going to persist for much longer than any sane person thinks is possible. So, I would like to think I'm sane, and it's already persisted 7 years longer than I thought it was possible. So, but the other side of the coin, of course, is we're at these ridiculous bubble levels in our markets. And as we've talked, of course, about previously in some of my visits to your show, there's no more profit for the crime syndicate to make in pumping these markets up any higher. So in the past, that's always been a guarantee that we're going to have a near-term crash because, the bubble and crash cycle was their main business. But then again, as we've just discussed, the one bank is currently sitting with infinite dollars. So, does it even think it needs to make money in the markets, through manipulating them anymore? Maybe it's just totally content with control. And so it's just going to, keep inching them higher and higher, in these little burps upward. Next thing you know, it's going to be Dow 40,000.
Jeff, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. How can people see your writings?
Well, I'm not doing as much on my own site, Bullion Bulls Canada, these days, because I've been branching out. I still do a weekly article for SprottMoney.com. Beyond that, my number one gig these days is doing market work for a company called Stockhouse.com, and I help small corporations promote themselves because these are the companies that are actually coming up with new ideas, creating jobs, and actually helping our economies. And so I'm doing some work that I can really enjoy and feel like I'm helping the world. But like I say, I still keep my hand in the game with my writing for Sprott Money.
Great. Jeff, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.